Congratulations! At this point, you have learned all of the concepts, all of the proof concepts that I want to teach you. You have learned predicate logic with identity. And for these last couple of weeks, what I want to do is simply apply what we have learned to some interesting philosophical issues. So today I want to talk about the relationship between quantification and existence. So I want to start off by considering how we might go about translating claims to the effect that certain kinds of things exist. So consider the sentence, aliens exist, for example. How do we translate this sentence into predicate logic? Well, it seems to me, at least, although this is controversial, and actually in the last lecture I'll talk a little bit more about why this is controversial, but it seems to me that the sentence aliens exist means the same thing as there are some aliens, or there is at least one alien. I take the sentence aliens exist to be equivalent to these sentences, and we know how to translate the sentence there are some aliens, or there is at least one alien. We translate that sentence as follows. There is an X such that X is an alien. I propose that this is how we translate the sentence aliens exist in predicate logic. Okay, so translating claims to the effect that certain kinds of things exists is relatively straightforward. Things are a little bit complicated when it comes to translating claims about individuals existing. So, how might we go about translating the claim that Socrates exists, for example? Well, one might take this sentence to be equivalent to there is such a thing as Socrates. And I think we can take that sentence to be equivalent to there is something that is identical to Socrates. So if we accept these equivalencies, if we take the sentence Socrates exists to be equivalent to there is something that is identical to Socrates, then we can translate the sentence Socrates exists as follows. There exists a y, or there is a y, such that y is identical to Socrates. Now you might note that I use the variable y here instead of the variable x. I had a reason for doing that, which you may see in a moment, but it doesn't really matter which variable I use. I could have used the variable x here if I wanted, and the translation would have been just as good. Okay, now that we translated the claim that Socrates exists, let's think about how we might translate the more general claim, the claim that says something exists. That claim, it turns out, has an interesting kind of status in our system. But first, let's consider how we might go about translating it. So, we saw that we translate the sentence Socrates exists as follows. There is a y such that y is identical to Socrates. We can go ahead then and get the claim that if this translation is correct, then we can get the claim that something exists by applying existential introduction to this claim. The application of existential introduction to the claim we have here, the claim that we are using to represent Socrates exists, would give us there is an x and there is a y such that y equals x. By the way, this explains why I used the variable y when I translated the sentence Socrates exists. I knew that I was going to want to have a sentence that I could get from the sentence that I used to translate Socrates exists by way of existential introduction, and that would involve putting another quantifier out front, and I wanted the variables that occurred out front to occur in alphabetical order, so it was for stylistic reasons. But the particular variables that I use here, or the order in which I put them, doesn't really matter. If the way I've translated Socrates exists is correct, this here at the bottom is the correct way to translate something exists. But there is something a little bit odd about all of this, and that's that this sequent here is provable in our system. So what this tells us is that if our translation procedure is on track, a sentence expressing the claim that something exists turns out to be a theorem of our system. That is, our system regards the sentence "something exists" as a logical truth. But one might think that that is something of a problem. So why think that's a problem? It's obvious that something exists. We all believe that things exist, so why not take it to be a logical truth that something exists? Well, one might think that it at least could have been the case that nothing existed. Now, this claim is controversial for reasons I'll talk about in a moment, but you might think it could have at least been the case that nothing existed. At the very least, you might think that logic by itself shouldn't tell us that this couldn't have been the case. But one might also think that the logical truths, including the things we want to turn out to be theorems of our system, should be things that are necessarily true. That is, the logical truths should be things that could not have possibly been false. Now, this claim is actually a bit controversial. Some philosophers think that it's not the case that the logical truths are necessary truths. I'm not really going to delve into that issue right now. I'm just going to point out that it's controversial, but also point out that many philosophers do think that this is the case. Many philosophers do think that logical truths, things that are true simply as a matter of logic, are things that are necessarily true. That is, things that couldn't have possibly been false. That is, things that are true in all possible worlds. Okay, but if it's a necessary truth that something exists, then it couldn't have been the case that nothing existed. But lots of philosophers think that could have been the case. Lots of philosophers think it could have turned out that there was nothing at all. Now, not all philosophers believe this. Some philosophers think, for example, that there are necessarily existing things, that is, there are certain things that couldn't possibly have failed to exist. Some philosophers think, for example, that numbers have this status. They think that the truths of mathematics are necessary truths. That is, they're things that are true in all possible worlds, and they're about numbers, so it must be the case that numbers themselves are necessary beings, that numbers exist in all possible worlds. Other philosophers may not think that numbers exist necessarily, but they might believe, say, in the existence of God, and they might think that God is a necessary being, that God is a being that exists in all possible worlds. Still, other philosophers might think that there aren't any things that exist necessarily. Nevertheless, it is a necessary truth that something or other exists. One reason some philosophers have thought that is they've thought, well, a necessary truth is something that is true in all possible worlds, but a possible world is just a state of affairs that involves certain things being a certain way. So in every possible world, there are things being certain ways. Maybe not the same things in each possible world, but there are some things in each possible world being certain ways. So in every possible world, it's true that something exists. These are things that philosophers have thought, but all of these claims, all of these considerations in favor of the claim that it's a necessary truth that something exists are controversial. It seems like it's a substantive philosophical question. There's a substantive philosophical debate to be had about whether it could have been the case that there is nothing. And in order for philosophers to conduct that debate, they're going to want to use a logic that is neutral with respect to the outcome. So even philosophers who do believe that it's a necessary truth that something exists may want to use a logic to try to convince other philosophers of that doesn't simply beg the question, that doesn't simply take it to be a logical truth that something exists. So it looks like we do have a problem here. It looks like our logical system is overcommitted. It looks like it's committed to a substantive philosophical claim that we do not wish for it to be committed to. It turns out that The reason that something exists, given our current translation proposal, is a theorem of our system. That turns out to be an artifact of a simplifying assumption we make when we do predicate logic. So we've already seen in a previous lecture that when we do predicate logic, we assume that the universe of discourse we are working with contains at least one thing. And this simplifying assumption that we make when we do predicate logic is, in principle, dispensable. There are so-called inclusive free logics, for example, that dispense with this assumption. So, if we wanted to, we could do without this assumption at the expense of making things a little bit more difficult for ourselves, at the expense of complicating our system a bit more. Now, the study of logical systems that dispense with this assumption are beyond the scope of this course, but I wanted to make you aware of this issue and aware of the fact that this assumption could, in principle, be dispensed with.